Welcome to the second part of Pastoral Ministry in Trauma. This is Pastoral Ministry 402, presented to you by Fruitland Baptist Bible College. I welcome you today. This is Steve Gouge, your instructor. Today you will learn the effects of trauma. You will learn one example of a stress disorder, and we'll look at the characteristics of PTSD. Before we talk about the effects of trauma, let's first of all review a little bit from part number 1. What is trauma? Well, in the physical realm, the word means a serious injury or shock to the body, as from violence or from an accident. The word can also refer to an emotional wound or shock that creates substantial, lasting damage to the psychological development of a person. It is an event or situation that causes great distress and disruption in one's life. The word trauma comes from a Greek word that means wound. Trauma is one's response to any event that shatters your world. Your world becomes unsafe, unpredictable in a trauma. It's more than a state of crisis. Trauma leaves you in that unsafe feeling that there's no place for you to run for refuge and help. Trauma can strike anyone at any time. Trauma leaves us feeling unsafe. It involves a loss. Trauma makes us feel overwhelmed. It is often unspeakable. Trauma can change or even challenge our view of God. And trauma produces hyperarousal, hyperalertness, and hypersensitivity. Those traumatized often re-experience the trauma. It relates to feelings of helplessness, and trauma just simply doesn't seem to make sense. Now, after that brief review of Part 1, we will begin to look at the effects of trauma on this slide and then the following two. How trauma impacts our thinking ability, causes us to be confused. We have poor problem-solving abilities when trauma has set in. There is distractibility. We're inattentive. We're hypervigilant. There's a disorientation of time, place, or person. On the previous slide, we talked about the effects of trauma as they related to thinking ability. Now on this slide, we continue the effects of trauma, but this time we're going to talk about how trauma impacts our behavior. Number 1, difficulty sleeping is a very common symptom of those who are affected by trauma. And then nightmares, and of course those go hand in hand. Nightmares can be very vivid and seem lifelike in every detail. There's an appetite disturbance. Often the person does not eat, or they can eat too much. They're hypervigilant. There's a startled response. A person affected by trauma will be startled very easily, and this startled reflex can be triggered by any number of different causes. There's a withdrawal from crowds and a tendency to isolate oneself away from others. Truly, this is a real problem with trauma because the isolation removes a person from the very people that could help them. When one is traumatized, it affects how we think. It affects our behavior. And on this slide, we will examine two more effects of trauma, and that is the emotional reactions created by trauma and then the physical response. The emotional reactions caused by trauma include these: guilt. There's anger sometimes associated with this issue, fear, anxiety, shock. And then physically, the entire immune system takes a hit. Not only is the brain chemistry altered by one's trauma, but also the immune system takes a hit, causing the individual to be susceptible to all kinds of diseases. So these are the effects of trauma. I have ministered to a number of people who have experienced trauma in their lives, and I will tell you about one of those that I had the privilege of ministering to who had PTSD later in this narrated PowerPoint. And now we turn our attention to an example of a stress disorder. It's post-traumatic stress disorder, commonly referred to as PTSD. The wound of trauma can cause a condition called PTSD. It's not just an emotional response to troubling events. It's the expression of a persistent deregulation of body and brain chemistry. And brain chemistry can be altered for decades. Trauma creates chaos in our brain and causes emotional as well as cognitive concussion. Entering the world of trauma is like looking into a fractured mirror. The familiar appears disjointed and disturbing. A strange new world begins to unfold. What are some of the characteristics of those who suffer from PTSD? Well, often they have flashbacks. These flashbacks are not limited to, but they almost always are associated with the anniversaries of the event. And those can trigger flashbacks and cause great turmoil in the person's life. Flashbacks can happen at many times during the year, not just at anniversaries, but they are particularly vivid on anniversaries of the events. Then traumatic dreams. And this, of course, results in difficulty sleeping. And when one's sleep patterns are interrupted, it can create deep psychological difficulties. Then memory disturbance. It's often accompanied by a hard time concentrating, not being able to give attention or focused attention to the details of living and life. And then persistent, intrusive recollections. These recollections are disturbing thoughts, perhaps of the death of individuals in war, or those types of persistent, intruding recollections that are associated with such catastrophic events as 9/11 just continue to bombard one's mind. Often, self-medication or substance abuse is associated with PTSD. It's an opportunity to try to remove oneself from the reality of the situation that they're experiencing and to gain some help in coping with PTSD. And then anger, irritability, great mood swings is also a part of this disorder. On this slide, we continue looking at the characteristics of PTSD. The person sometimes will have a dazed or numb appearance. They will be susceptible to panic attacks at inopportune moments. There can also be a phobia formation. Almost always you find hypervigilance, and they have survivor's guilt often. They feel guilty over being the one who was left behind. As promised, I want to tell you a story about Gordon, a man who suffered from PTSD in the ministry that I had. He was a person who had survived the war in Vietnam, and yet he came back home with PTSD. I've never seen a more isolated or withdrawn individual in my life. His wife joined our church, but gave us instructions, never come to my home, for my husband is not at all interested in religious things and certainly wouldn't welcome people from the church. She was scheduled for a surgical procedure, and so I went to the hospital to provide pastoral ministry and support. He was there, of course. He didn't say 2 words to me during a 2.5-hour surgery. He was very obnoxious. He was an individual who was aloof and isolated and alone. I gave him his space, but tried to love on him. Gordon went through some difficult times because his wife actually left him. She left him and gave no forwarding address whatsoever. Gordon reached out to the church because we had reached out to him, and there was a Sunday school class that began to love on Gordon, to take him meals, to include him in the Sunday school socials and the Sunday school class. And one morning, this very aloof, very aggressive, individual who was prone to panic attacks and was just a individual that you would characterize as one who would not likely respond to the gospel, sent me a message that said, "Pastor Steve, please don't close the invitation this morning before I can make a response." You see, he walked very slowly because of injuries he had experienced in Vietnam. His knees were damaged severely. And so he didn't want me to close the invitation before he had an opportunity to walk to the front and make a profession of faith. I had the joy of baptizing Gordon. And what a joy it was. When he came out of the baptismal waters, he gave me one of those wonderful big old wet hugs that I will never forget. You likely will engage and encounter individuals in your ministry that are experiencing PTSD or other stress disorders. My encouragement to you is to love on them. Whether it's a natural catastrophe like a hurricane or the burning of a building or whatever the disturbance is that caused the trauma, love on these people. Lead them to Jesus.